Hey guys, welcome and welcome back. I wanted to share with you a few thoughts that I had surrounding both the Watts wedding as well as Nutgate. Before we get started, if you would like to support the channel, no cost to you, then please hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. Something that has caught my attention lately with the Watts case has been the ongoing chatter regarding the Watts wedding and Nutgate. Additionally, the tension between Cindy and Shanann, which is a topic that hasn't really been addressed much here on the channel, but I feel many are impacted by similar relational issues. Many of you know already, but for those of you who don't know, the Nutgate event happened the summer of 2018 while Shanann and the kids were visiting the Watts family. After gathering as much information as I could on the subject, it appears the following is at least somewhat of what happened. As any grandmother would have it, the grandchildren were over playing and enjoying themselves over at Grandma's house that summer. Cindy had been keeping her daughter's children while she was working, just typical small town grandparents hanging out with grandchildren. So other children were there and present. One of the grandchildren went into the freezer and grabbed an ice cream cup. The flavor was actually vanilla. However, the concern from Shanann was apparently due to the manufacturing company and cross-contamination potential. There is a heightened level of alarm when you have a child who is anaphylactic to nuts. Given the probars were later determined to possibly contain tree nuts, it goes to show how, in my opinion, the actual issue here had nothing to do with nuts at all. It's been mentioned that the explosive confrontation between Cindy and Shanann occurred once the statement was made about Cece not always needing to get what she wants. So let's really look at this statement. What else was brewing within the family during this time? Was it even about ice cream at all? Let's be authentic and take note that the majority of the time it's not even about what you say, it's how you say it. And in this situation, I do believe this was at play, especially during this argument. Cece was old enough, and frankly, it's evident, in my opinion, as a parent, by looking at some of these videos, that discipline was lacking in some areas with the Watts children. Yeah, it's normal for them to have energy and, they're learning to communicate. However, there are videos where it's evident that Cece pretty much did what she wanted when she wanted, and Shanann was like begging her to stop. I know some will disagree, but I believe we see a good combination of both discipline and areas when and where it's been lacking. When you have a child allergic to nuts, it's especially important to explain to them on their level the dangers. So for example, my cousin used to walk around during the holidays and she would say, "No nuts," and she would shake her little curls. She had a head full of curly hair, and she would shake it and she would say, "No nuts." And she would just make sure, at 3 years old, she would tell us almost every time we'd sit down at the dinner table, "No nuts," because she knew that if she even remotely touched anything near a nut, she would have to go to the hospital and it would be pretty intense. So this nerve in this conversation was struck by something deeper than the surface. Solicited or unsolicited advice has and will always come from grandparents in some form or fashion. Cindy, in my opinion, wasn't wrong for trying to share this concept with Shanann that, it was okay for Cece not to get what she wanted or not to get her way. But to make a statement such as she can't always get what she wants is setting the stage for a fight when you know that your own son is getting exactly what he wants back in Colorado. This is where I raise the question, keeping in mind Shanann had already been there in North Carolina for approximately 2 weeks. So things were amping up with Kessinger back in Colorado. I don't want to dive too deep into that for the purpose of this video. However, the disdain between Cindy and Shanann was not rooted in an ice cream cup. If Shanann noticed Chris was growing more and more distant, not answering calls, etc., then it became evident to Shanann that Cindy and Ronnie had knowledge of another woman, then that, in my opinion, would snowball into one huge blowout, resulting in that she can't have everything she wants, coming across as a very hypocritical statement if you consider that Shanann in that moment was not getting anything she wanted because Chris was emotionally and by this time physically attached to another woman, which was clearly what he wanted. Does that make sense? Definitely not over an ice cream cup. Furthermore, if this was actually what fueled the fire, then wouldn't it justify to some degree the explosiveness of the argument? Many have claimed or attempted to diagnose Shanann and Cindy both with personality disorders. However, the response, in my opinion, was reasonable given the appearance of deception, manipulation, a starvation of basic security needs, i.e., feeling like your family unit is completely crumbling. This isn't to say that yelling and screaming in front of the children were okay. However, before you or anyone else starts to label someone as unstable or any other derogatory term, it's important to remember they both had raw emotions, not to mention pregnancy hormones galore. Shanann's pushback against the Watts was almost a means of self-preservation for their marriage. I don't care who you are. If you're pregnant, married, and you find out that your in-laws know that the in-laws you're staying with know or have knowledge that your husband is or your spouse is having an affair, that's not going to sit well with you or anybody. Maybe it's just speculating, but maybe Shanann did not vent to her family because at that point she was just needing to get Chris to North Carolina. Maybe then they could reconnect. That's why I believe when she picks him up at the airport and he remains disconnected, it throws her again, loop after loop. Even their anniversary. She had high hopes for their anniversary and reconnecting, and it just wasn't happening. Remember their dating anniversary? This one moment, she can't have everything she wants, and Shanann got upset about it. Tone and delivery are major players at this time. Then obviously any underlying issues that came to the surface would have, in my opinion, been the reason why it bowled over. Shanann calling and pleading for her father to come pick her up from the Watts home was, in my opinion, a grown woman trying to flee to her safety from a situation that she clearly felt she had no control over. For whatever reason, some remained tight-lipped over the mistress and the affair. Hello, people. We already know he had an affair. We know about the mistress. Why not just come clean about the freaking timeline? In an interview, Cindy briefly mentions the idea of an emotional connection with someone that summer, so there was something boiling in North Carolina far more than ice cream. As for the social media lashing out, you guys can bash her all you want, but 95% of people still go to Facebook and passive-aggressively address an issue because they either still need to feel like they're being heard or have some form of support. I think it's a no-brainer that she was inside the Watts home. This argument ensued, and you've got Jamie, you've got Cindy, you've got Ronnie, and they were in the Watts home, and Shanann didn't feel like anyone had her back, and so she took to Facebook. And I mean, no one really wants to have that confrontation, and clearly this was her emotional outlet. You don't have to choose to do the same as Shanann, but it was how she handled her emotions during that season of her life. She was in an emotional hell and felt little to no support from those who should have been embracing and encouraging her the most. Let's be honest, the Watts were not fond of Shanann. Cindy has said in interviews, and it's my personal opinion, that the concept of Chris having an emotional affair was actually accepted on some level, because if the marriage ended, then the Watts were prepared to fully embrace anyone besides Shanann. Only the player played with the devil, and they lost it all. Chase two girls, lose the one. Taylor Swift. This brings me to the topic of the wedding. I've watched the interviews and I've read the discovery. The explanations we hear as to why the Watts did not attend the wedding, in my opinion, are all products of grief. Again, it's a surface answer when the deeper emotion and reasoning is too hard or difficult to acknowledge at the moment. Making a comment about Chris's hair or looking like a skater boy, having their own expectations for their own relationship, which may have looked different than Cindy and Ronnie, is, in my opinion, no reason to not attend the wedding of your son. I can 100% understand if the reservation was due to Shania having been married previously and not Chris. Maybe they heard something about her in that previous marriage that was off-putting to them. And I think it's very fair for the Watts to be able to express these concerns that they had. The idea that Shania's reputation is so protected that no one wants to just be open and honest about what happened in that marriage, that sets up red flags for anybody as well. And regardless if Jamie had been married previously or not, this was Chris's first marriage. Looking at Chris earlier in his clothing choices, he kind of did dress like a little skater boy. But that was kind of hip back in 2003, 4, I don't know. Maybe he just was still trying to figure out how in the world to dress himself. I don't know. Everyone kind of goes through their own phases, Gosh, if I had to look back on all of the style and fashion choices and trends that I've experienced throughout life, some of them are just cringeworthy. But Shania had just started dating Chris. He even says in the prison interview that, he showed up to their first date very underdressed for the date. He was anticipating it being something completely different. And so do I think there was a social imbalance in the beginning? Possibly. But do I think that Shania making comments about Chris's hair or how he dressed, I don't know what it is that just comes across as like that would just be small talk, and maybe mom and Shania like giggling off to the side about something. But to say that that's why you didn't show up to your son's wedding, I don't buy that. I don't buy that at all, because it's highly unlikely that Shania meant any of those things to be negative. There isn't anything wrong with noting that the person you fell in love with isn't at all the normal type of person that you would go for. There's more to them choosing not to attend the wedding. In these interviews, Cindy is genuinely sharing her thoughts about Shania currently and at that moment. The interviews were done shortly after the plea deal was signed. So keeping in mind that even when the plea deal was signed, the Watts were still under the impression that the first confession was the real confession. In a whirlwind, Cindy's world was rocked and crumbled. She would never again have her son home for summer breaks or holidays, never have the laughter that filled their house that summer, or even the enjoyable conversations with Shania, as she's no doubtedly had over the years. It's my opinion that there were things Shania may or may not have done that they did or did not like, yet they knew their own son had done some of the same things. For example, Chris wasn't just going to work day in and day out, coming home and having zero idea of what was going on financially without enjoying the fruits of his own labor. Kessinger took one look at their life and questioned how they could afford everything. Outside of not having his own vehicle, we never actually see Chris tinkering around with any other automotive projects. Most mechanics keep some type of project for tinkering on the weekends. However, it wasn't like they went on a lot of road trips or anything, so one vehicle for their family, it worked for them. He helped Shania take really good care of the Lexus and thoroughly seemed to enjoy himself on these Thrive trips. So I don't know if you've ever had to deal with the experience of a covert narcissist or someone who is just passive-aggressively abusive, but they will be the first ones to jump up and get so excited about a trip or an event or just doing something. And then the moment reality hits, they're the first ones to turn around and say, "Oh, I knew we shouldn't have gone," or "I told you that wasn't within the budget." Well, yeah, but you still went along with it. See what I'm saying? They go along with it and they enjoy the perks and the benefits of it, but then any moment of criticism, suddenly the blame shifts over. So, no, I don't believe Chris was doing all that type of work blindly without knowing what was happening in their bank accounts. He would like for everyone to believe that because if he gets to be the victim in that and passively insults Shania's bookkeeping in the process. I'm not defending either one of them, rather stating that in my opinion the reason Cindy only touches superficially on some issues when asked about their marriage, finances, etc., is because they know just as well that their own son and Shania were two peas in a pod, and it worked until one day it didn't. I think those things are important to take note of because he didn't have a problem going along with those things. It wasn't until their lifestyle was in the headlines that he seemed to grow a concern for them. I'm not going to not show up for my son's wedding because his fiance is calling him a goober sometimes. There were more reasons, in my opinion, for why they chose not to attend the wedding. Some questions I would have for Mrs. Cindy would be, how did life change when Shania came into the picture? What did that look like for you and Ronnie? How did you cope and handle their engagement? Did you have family dinners together with them? What were the holidays like before they got married or engaged? These are questions I'd ask because that time period of dating and engagement are the only times that they would have really had a chance to get to know her. So at the same time, if your son is preparing to get married, there's an amount of responsibility that falls on his shoulders, and as parents, you have to kind of back off a little bit. When Shania's handing him the text messages that she did about, basically like the leave and cleave scripture, in my opinion, it shows that she felt like he wasn't choosing her over his parents. And this is a wedge that certainly continues to drive deep within this family. If we take what we've been given, then maybe we can really focus on what the real issues are beneath the surface. Some question why I cover this. And it's because the saddest part is so many people in our country and around the world live and experience life the same way. There are lessons to be learned, and the relationship between Cindy and Shania is very important in my opinion. You guys that have been here on my channel know that sometimes I share a little personal nugget of experience along the way. Some of you like it, some don't, and that's kind of the beauty of the channel. But my son's father, when we were, I guess we were really young when we got together. I was 21. And we dated for 3 years and got married. But when I first met his mother, she was a nurse at the time. His stepfather was an engineer. He came from a family with clearly more money than my parents. My stepdad was a fisherman, and my mom stayed at home raising all of us kids. And I remember meeting his mom for the first time. My son was only about 5 months old, and she and I were both in the medical field, so we had some level of common interest that we could talk about. However, oh my goodness, it was one of those things where I felt that I was never going to be good enough for her. It didn't matter what I did. If I said something and did not phrase it intelligently enough, then it wouldn't be enough. It got exhausting. It took the first year and a half before I gained my own footing and felt confident enough in myself to say, listen, lady, I might be 21 years old, but I'm perfectly capable of taking care of my own child. And it's, we'll laugh at it now, but that was something we always struggled with. Does he need a bath time like this? Does he eat this? What about developmentally? And it was just one thing after another, after another, after another. And it was all in love. But when you're the mother and have this grandmother trying to say, you need to do this, you need to do that, it doesn't take long before it starts to just get under your skin. And his mother was very passive aggressive. I don't even know if I could say passive. He was pretty direct, blunt, in your face, but just very strong. And she was straight up square up with you. And I remember one of mine and my ex-husband's very first big fights or arguments was over the way his mother spoke to me, and he did not defend me in that moment. And I was always taught to be respectful, mind your manners. So I didn't want to overstep. And I didn't want her to not like me because I loved her son. So I walked a fine line for quite some time, and as long as I could, until eventually I shared my thoughts with her and then laid into him. Basically telling him that if you're not going to take up for me and have my back and stand up for me, then this isn't going to work. And we left their house that day, went back to our place, and the argument continued because, I was pissed off and I was hurt. And this was back in MySpace days, so you didn't really update your status with Facebook and stuff, but it really hits home because no one wants to feel like you're with someone and not their partner, nor do you want to feel like you're fighting with their family. It's just a horrible position to be in. And my ex-husband ended up, he ended up apologizing to me, and then he returned to his parents' house to speak with them. And I don't even think we talked to them for like 2 weeks afterwards. And keep in mind that back then, she would often watch my son if I was having to work an extra shift or something. But that was kind of the mentality of their family dynamic, was that if we were at odds with each other, then they weren't going to help anymore. And I laugh it off now, but guys, this stuff is so true and it's so accurate. But for people to act like, Shania's mean or Cindy's a narcissist and both of them are so horrible, stating that Cindy hated Shania and Shania hated Cindy. I don't believe that for a minute. Were they besties? No. But was it so bad that they hated each other? I don't know. It's my opinion, much like many in-laws, they certainly had their moments of good and disappointing. With my ex-mother-in-law, it wasn't until the divorce that she was like, oh, I miss you, and she apologized for some of the stuff that she'd done throughout the relationship. Now, almost 17, 18 years later, we communicate from time to time. She's now a nurse practitioner, I'm a nurse, and I'll ask her opinions on some things and others not so much. I'll check in on her from time to time, but at the end of the day, she's my son's grandmother, and while we may not be the best of friends, it's important to grow with that relationship. So I like to share this personal side because I feel like it's important to know that this case, the Watts case, yeah, it's on Lifetime and it's on Netflix, and it's, in some twisted sense, it's been glamorized. But the part no one is talking about is, guys, if you've been raising children in any stage of life, then almost daily someone has some form of advice, whether it's solicited or unsolicited, that they're giving. And literally from the time the stick turns pink, everyone has an opinion of what works best. And for the most part, folks are open and listen. You learn to treat it as like in one ear, out the other, if it's not for you. Or if you're really genuinely open to trying what they have, then you try and see if it works out. But for some reason in this case, it seems like all of that has been lost. Everyone looks at it like it's Watts versus Rusex or Shania versus Cindy. But in my opinion, it couldn't be more further from the truth. It is almost a dishonor and disservice to Shania as a parent to assume that she would just blow up like that over ice cream. Because depending on their personal experiences with interactions of Cece with nuts, then some level of respect or concern should be considered. This makes me think back to a time when I was a child. I had a split visitation with my grandparents and my mom. And back then, there were grandparents' rights. Unfortunately, I had to live through that hell. But basically, with my father being incarcerated my whole life, his parents felt the need to, quote unquote, fill the void of his absence by being very active within my upbringing. Kind of makes sense. And, I'm thankful for their presence in my life now as an adult, but I hated it as a kid. Something I remember very vividly was the orange push-up. This was my favorite ice cream at the corner store, and my mom used to get one for me every time we would stop and get gas. On each weekend visit with my grandparents, I would usually have some type of sinus infection or allergies acting up. I was sick all the dang time. My grandparents thought it was because I was allergic to milk. They insisted it was a milk allergy. My pediatrician said no, but because my grandfather was allergic to milk products, they insisted I too had a milk allergy. So when I would go visit with them, I'd constantly hear about how they couldn't believe my mother would give me milk knowing that it made me sick. This very obviously made for an uncomfortable visit every time. It took until day 2 to get settled in, and then it was time to go back home. And I remember holding in sneezes trying to keep from hearing comments. Like I'd get into a sneezing fit and I'd hear something like, well, if you weren't drinking milk at your mom's, then you wouldn't be sick, or something ridiculous like that. So as a child, I'd go from one household being told I couldn't have ice cream or milk, then return to my mom and have milk in my cereal, ice cream, etc. The truth is, guys, I'm allergic to the trees in the area up here, but I tolerate milk just fine. It was the dang trees. It's important to focus on this. Was I lactose intolerant? Maybe. Did it kill me? No. Did my mom adhere to it? No. Did she love me any less? No. My grandparents genuinely believed what they were doing was protecting me and that they were right. So were they wrong for doing what they did? No. It's all relative to the actual situation. Cindy is not the first grandmother to give a kid something that their parent says they cannot have. She's not the first grandmother to not trust or believe a diagnosis that a child has been given without questioning the validity of it. She's not the first grandparent to suggest a different approach with discipline, which is all why I say that Nutgate and the Watts wedding cover up and hide a lot more truths about Chris Watts and the family dynamic than what we realize. That week in the summer of 2018 was pivotal in my opinion. I believe Chris was telling his father all about the woman he met, how the pregnancy has now complicated things. This message was relayed to some degree to Cindy per her interview. Cindy notes Chris wasn't happy about the pregnancy announcement. Shanann, being in North Carolina on an extended visit, the North Carolina heat, pregnancy hormones, small spaces with loud kids, constantly having to question why the husband isn't acting like himself. Why is he ignoring her calls? Why he hasn't inquired about her or the baby? All to potentially pick up on the fact that his parents may have known exactly what he was doing. Then have the audacity to tell you that your kid can't get what she wants. Cindy might as well have told Shanann that she couldn't have everything she wanted. And that would have unleashed the wrath of pregnancy hormones, brokenness, pain, hurt, confusion, exhaustion, and many others. If you've ever moved in with family temporarily, then this is something you probably know a little bit better than others. At the end of the day, they were and are all humans with human emotions. The timing of these interviews plays a significant role in their answers. Attacking one or the other doesn't solve anything, nor does it help anyone in the future. Look at the gray areas and learn from them. That's how you grow.